The Exiles had long resigned themselves to their fate. Humanity, once the dominant force in the galaxy, had been exiled after a great war against the galaxy's other powers. A war they had lost due to the brutal fear the galaxy's elites held for humanity's potential. Earth, their homeworld, had been sealed off, forgotten by all but a few remnants of humanity's scattered descendants. Now they lived on a small, isolated colony, Centurion Station, light years away from their ancestral home. The planet was nothing more than a myth, a faded memory passed down in whispered stories. But then, in the depths of the station's underbelly, Lyra Hale discovered something that would change everything. She had been working in the archives for weeks, trying to decipher an old series of signals intercepted by Centurion's long-range scanners, believing they were nothing more than remnants of ancient galactic noise. But as she sifted through the data, a pattern began to emerge, faint yet unmistakable. The signal was regular, deliberate. She traced it back to a distant sector of space, far beyond the exile colonies. The source, if she could believe her findings, was Earth. For days, Lyra stared at the data, her mind racing. Earth, could it really be? The homeworld humanity had lost was a place of legend, a story that older exiles told with misty eyes, clinging to the hope that one day someone would return. The faint whisper of signal, however, was something more than myth. It was a beacon, an unmistakable call that Earth still lived, still existed, buried beneath layers of time and galactic politics. Lyra had to know more. She rushed to the station's communication center, ignoring the warnings that the station's resources were already stretched thin. "I need a transmission boost to the source coordinates. It's urgent." She barely waited for a response before setting the necessary coordinates into the system herself. "What are you doing, Lyra?" A voice called behind her. It was Xavier, her colleague and sometimes friend. He was a cynic, a man who had long given up hope of ever seeing Earth again. "You've seen the signal. It's from Earth, Xavier. I'm trying to reach it." His eyes narrowed, his skepticism apparent. "Earth's a fairy tale, Lyra. A myth. The rest of us are trying to survive out here. You're chasing ghosts." But Lyra wasn't deterred. "You don't understand. If we can reach Earth, if we can prove it's still there." Her voice trailed off as the signal strengthened. The boost was working. There was a glimmer of something real in the data, a solid connection. Earth was out there. Xavier hesitated, then stepped closer, his eyes drawn to the screen. The signal was unmistakable now, stronger and clearer than it had been before. He swallowed, a look of disbelief creeping onto his face. "You're right, it's real." Before Lyra could respond, a harsh alarm blared across the station. A red light flashed overhead. "Unauthorized transmission detected." The alert blared, and within moments, armed security guards stormed the communications room. "Lyra Hale," a commanding voice echoed over the intercom. "You are in violation of station protocol. Stand down immediately." Lyra's heart raced. She glanced at Xavier, who was already backing away, hands raised in surrender. They had been detected, but Lyra wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "They can't stop us from reaching Earth," she said, determination in her voice. With one last glance at the incoming guards, she hit the send command, transmitting a return pulse to the coordinates of the signal. The call had been made, and as the guards rushed into the room, Lyra's pulse quickened. She knew that this wasn't just about finding Earth anymore. It was about something bigger, the spark of a revolution that could change everything for humanity. Lyra's heart pounded as the guards stormed the communications room, their boots echoing against the metal floor. She barely registered Xavier slipping away, his shadow vanishing into the dim corridors as he escaped the chaos. Her hands trembled, but she fought to steady herself, knowing the transmission had been sent. Earth's signal was out there, and no one could stop it now. "Lyra Hale," one of the guards barked, advancing toward her. He was a tall man, his uniform adorned with the insignia of Centurion Station's security forces. His face was impassive, but there was a glint of something more dangerous in his eyes. Lyra stood frozen, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to be caught, but this wasn't the time for panic. She knew there was no turning back now. Whatever came next, she had to stay focused. With a sharp breath, she turned toward the main terminal and quickly accessed the station's emergency systems. "Don't try anything," the guard warned, but Lyra was already working. A quiet beep echoed through the terminal, signaling that the emergency lockdown had been initiated. The entire station was on lockdown, sealing off the communications room from the rest of Centurion. The guard's face twisted in frustration as he reached for his comm device, but Lyra was faster. "You can't stop me," she said, a cold edge to her voice. "I've already sent the signal. Earth is real. You know it too, don't you? We're not the forgotten species you've been told we are. The galaxy has hidden the truth from us for far too long." The guard paused, confusion flickering across his face. He'd been trained to suppress rebellions, not deal with someone who knew about Earth. The memory of the homeworld was a touchy subject among the Exiles. Most preferred to forget it altogether. The silence between them grew thick and charged. Just then, a new voice interrupted the standoff. "Step away from the terminal, Lieutenant." The voice was commanding, unmistakably authoritative. Lyra turned, eyes widening as the station's security chief, Commander Yara Valen, entered the room. Unlike the other guards, Yara wasn't here to intimidate. She was a woman of power and influence, and Lyra had always respected her from afar. Yara's cold eyes settled on Lyra, her gaze unreadable. "Commander," Lyra said, her voice firm. "I've made contact with Earth. The signal is real. Humanity is not lost. We've been exiled, but that can change. The truth is out there, Yara." Yara stepped forward, her expression tight. "And what truth is that?" she asked, her tone betraying none of the shock Lyra had hoped for. "You've broken protocol, Lyra. You've endangered the station, and now I've done what no one else had the courage to do." Lyra cut in, stepping forward. "I've shown that Earth is still out there. We've been lied to, and you—" "Enough," Yara snapped, her voice hard. The guards tensed, but she raised her hand to stop them. She turned her gaze back to Lyra. "I know what you found, and I know what it means." Lyra's eyes widened, "You know." Yara's lips curled into a grim smile, one that did not reach her eyes. "I've known for years, Lyra. The signal wasn't just an accident. It was a warning. Earth was never meant to be found. The powers that be in the galaxy, those who orchestrated our exile, don't want us returning. They've kept Earth's existence hidden for a reason. The galaxy fears us." Lyra's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. The person she thought might be her enemy had just confirmed everything. There was more at play here than anyone could have imagined. "I didn't come here to ask permission," Lyra said, her voice filled with resolve. "I came here to tell you that Earth is out there, and we will reclaim it. I'm going to rally the Exiles, and we'll have the truth. We'll return to Earth, and nothing will stop us." Yara's gaze hardened, her lips parting as though she might protest. But the words never came. For a moment, she simply watched Lyra, her mind clearly calculating the consequences. She wasn't opposed to the idea. She knew better than most what the Exiles had suffered, and yet she knew the truth was dangerous. "You've already started something," Yara said, her voice soft but unmistakably resigned. "The Exiles won't stop now, and neither will I." For the first time, Lyra allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and the fight for humanity's future had begun. The rebellion had officially begun, and the spark Lyra had ignited spread through the exile community like wildfire. What had started as a whisper, a solitary belief that Earth could still be out there, now burned with a fierce intensity. Lyra, once an isolated scientist, had become a symbol of humanity's lost hope, a hope that Earth, their ancestral cradle, might one day be restored. But the journey to reclaim Earth would not be easy. The Vectra, the syndicate that had enforced the Exiles' isolation, were already closing in. Lyra sat in the dimly lit war room of Centurion Station, the maps and plans spread out before her. The rebellion's leadership was fractured, but the momentum was undeniable. The Exiles had been fractured for so long, divided by their fear of their own potential, by the scars left from their exile. Yet now, a united front began to form. People from all walks of life, scientists, soldiers, engineers, and politicians, were coming together with a common cause. Earth was no longer a myth. It was real, and they were going to fight for it. Rook Sanders, the seasoned soldier who had reluctantly joined Lyra's cause, stood at the map table, scanning their next move. His broad shoulders tensed as his eyes traced the coordinates Lyra had uncovered. Earth was closer than they'd ever been, but so were the dangers that lay in their path. The Vectra weren't the only threat. The galaxy's ruling factions would do anything to prevent humanity from returning to its place of power. "We need more than just a plan," Rook said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "We need a weapon, something to level the playing field." Lyra glanced up from the plans, her gaze narrowing. She had been expecting this question. After all, a group of exiled rebels, no matter how determined, were no match for the well-equipped Vectra and the other galactic powers that sought to keep humanity in its place. But Lyra had been digging into the archives, searching for something, anything, that could help. "There is a weapon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "an ancient one, hidden beneath Centurion Station. It's from the days of Earth's greatest expansion, before the exile. It's not just a weapon, Rook. It's a relic of humanity's prime, something that could change everything." Rook's eyes locked onto hers, a mixture of skepticism and intrigue in his expression. What kind of weapon? Lyra stood and walked to a nearby terminal, her fingers quickly tapping in commands. A holographic display flickered to life, showing a series of schematics. The object, she revealed, was massive, far too large to be anything like a typical weapon. It resembled a relic from an ancient civilization, but the energy readings on the scans were off the charts. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she pointed to the central core of the object. "This," she said, "is the core of the Terran Regulator, a device capable of harnessing and amplifying human ingenuity and strength. It was designed as a defense mechanism, a means of protecting humanity's colonies during their early years of expansion. But it was deactivated long before the exile." Rook leaned closer, his gaze fixed on the schematics. Why wasn't it used? If this thing was so powerful, why was it hidden? Lyra hesitated before answering. Because humanity didn't need it, until now. The Terran Regulator was built to protect Earth's interests, but after the fall of the human empire, it was deemed too dangerous. The galactic powers feared it might turn the tide of any conflict, so they sealed it away and the archives were buried. Rook nodded slowly. "So we find it, we activate it, and it becomes our weapon against the Vectra." Lyra's face was a mix of determination and uncertainty. "It's not that simple. We'll need to reactivate the regulator, but doing so might trigger something, more than we expect. It wasn't just designed to protect humanity, it was also meant to test the limits of human capability. If we're not careful, we might awaken something we can't control." Rook's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. The path forward was dangerous, uncertain, and filled with peril, but they were no longer alone. The Exiles had their purpose, and with the Terran Regulator, they might have the power to claim their birthright once more. "Then we take that risk," Rook said, his voice resolute. "We don't just fight for Earth, we fight for humanity's future." With a steady nod, Lyra agreed. The fight for Earth had just begun, and they were ready to face whatever came next. The days following the discovery of the Terran regulator were filled with frantic preparations. Lyra, Rook, and their makeshift rebel crew spent every waking hour gathering supplies, strategizing, and recruiting more defectors from within Centurion Station. The news of Earth's survival and the weapon beneath the station had spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of those who had always suspected that humanity had more to offer than exile. It was no longer just a fight for Earth, it was a fight for their very place in the galaxy. But despite the swelling numbers of rebels, the path ahead remained uncertain. The Vectra had already begun to tighten their grip on Centurion Station, sending wave after wave of enforcers to quash any form of resistance. Lyra knew they couldn't remain hidden for much longer. The sooner they could retrieve the regulator, the better. The plan was simple, but fraught with danger. A small team would infiltrate the deepest vaults of the station, bypassing layers of security to reach the regulator's hiding place. Once they had it, they would need to extract it and activate it before the Vectra could stop them. "We need to move fast," Rook said, pacing in front of the crew. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that matched the urgency in the air. "The longer we wait, the more likely the Vectra will find out what we're after." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the gathered faces of the rebels. Some were former military, others technicians or diplomats who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of their exile. But now they were all united by one goal: returning humanity to power. "We've mapped the vault," Lyra continued, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in her mind. "There are 4 main entrances, all heavily guarded. The regulator is located deep beneath the central reactor core. We'll need to move quickly, avoid detection, and disable the security system before we can access the vault. Once we have it, we'll need to get out without being caught." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but none voiced their doubts. They were committed. "You're sure about this?" Rook asked, looking directly at Lyra. "You really think the regulator can be activated? That it will do what you think it will do?" Lyra hesitated but then nodded. "I can't be certain, but everything I've seen suggests that it holds the key to humanity's future. We have no choice but to try." With the plan in place, they set off. The infiltration team, consisting of Rook, Lyra, and a few handpicked engineers, made their way to the vault access point. The corridors of Centurion Station were eerily quiet as they moved through the shadows, each footfall calculated, each breath held. Security cameras scanned the hallways, but Lyra had already hacked into the station's surveillance systems, creating a temporary blind spot for their movements. "We're almost there," Lyra whispered, her voice tight with focus. Her fingers flew over the datapad, entering commands that would keep the next layer of security offline for just long enough. She knew they didn't have much time. As they approached the vault's entrance, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. A patrol was coming their way, and Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "We're not alone," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Rook's hand instinctively moved to the sidearm at his hip, but he held back. "We need to be smart. Let them pass." They flattened themselves against the wall, holding their breath as the patrol passed by. Lyra's pulse hammered in her chest, but she didn't move a muscle. The seconds felt like hours, but eventually the footsteps faded into the distance. "Clear," she breathed. With a final swipe of her hand, the vault door opened, revealing the pathway to the regulator. But as they descended deeper into the vault, Lyra felt the air grow thicker, heavier. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as though the regulator was calling to them, its dormant power pulsing beneath the surface of the station. The walls of the vault seemed to hum with ancient energy, a reminder of the power humanity had once wielded and lost. "Here it is," Lyra whispered as they entered the inner chamber. The regulator lay before them, an enormous crystalline structure surrounded by intricate alien technology. It shimmered faintly, its surface etched with markings that Lyra couldn't yet decipher, but its energy was palpable. This was no ordinary relic. This was humanity's last chance. Rook stepped forward, eyes wide as he took in the sight. It's even more than I imagined. Lyra nodded. We found it. Now we activate it, before the Vectra come for us. Just as she began to approach the central control console, a loud, shrill alarm blared to life, shattering the stillness. The entire station had been alerted. The hunt had begun. The blaring alarm was like a slap to the face, jolting everyone into action. The moment the first shrill note echoed through the vault, Lyra's heart leaped into her throat. She barely had time to process the sound before Rook was already at her side, moving quickly to the central console of the regulator. We've got minutes, Rook muttered under his breath as he pulled out a small toolkit and began working on the console, his hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Lyra stood behind him, watching the entrance nervously. Every second felt like a lifetime. The regulator, humanity's last hope, was right there, but it had to be activated before the Vectra arrived. If they were caught now, everything would be lost. Can you get it running? She asked, her voice tense with urgency. I can try, Rook grunted, twisting a connector into place. But we don't exactly have a user manual for this thing. The wall-mounted screens around them flickered to life, revealing a series of cryptic symbols, some of which Lyra recognized from her previous research on ancient Terran technology. But there was no time to analyze them now. They needed to bring the regulator online, fast. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the chamber's corridors. The Vectra were coming. Rook, hurry! Lyra hissed, her pulse quickening as the footsteps grew louder. She darted to the door, peering through the small crack to see the shadows of soldiers approaching. We don't have much time. Rook's fingers flew over the controls, his face set in a grim expression as he worked. I'm almost there, just a few more. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room, and the regulator's crystalline structure began to glow, pulsing with a bright, eerie light. The energy coursing through the vault was unlike anything Lyra had ever felt before. It was as though the very air itself had become charged with power. The sound of the regulator powering up drowned out the footsteps of the approaching guards, but Lyra could still feel the imminent danger. She turned back toward Rook, who had finally stepped away from the console, a relieved but cautious look on his face. We did it, he said, his voice quiet but triumphant. The regulator's online. We've awakened it. The light from the regulator grew brighter, filling the entire vault with an almost blinding glow. Lyra squinted, her heart racing as she felt the regulator's immense energy begin to resonate with something deep inside her. It wasn't just a weapon, it was something more, something deeply tied to humanity's forgotten potential. She could feel it, an ancient primal force awakening within the station. But their victory was short-lived. The door to the vault slammed open with a deafening clang. Vectra soldiers flooded in, weapons drawn, their faces twisted in anger and fear. Lyra instinctively reached for a sidearm, but Rook stepped in front of her, his own weapon already raised. You, the lead Vectra soldier shouted, his voice cold and commanding. You've activated the regulator. You have no idea what you've just unleashed. Lyra's eyes flashed with determination. I know exactly what we've unleashed. Humanity's return. The soldiers hesitated, the air thick with tension. The regulator was still glowing, its energy escalating, and Lyra knew it was only a matter of time before it reached a critical point. They had no more time for negotiations or standoffs. Rook, get to the controls, Lyra snapped. We need to override the station's security grid. It's the only way we're getting out of here. Rook didn't hesitate. He sprinted to a secondary terminal, fingers flying over the controls as the Vectra soldiers moved into position. Lyra, knowing the odds were against them, didn't waste a second. She took cover behind a pillar, her weapon aimed at the doorway, prepared to make her stand. You're outnumbered, the Vectra leader sneered, stepping forward. There's no escape. Lyra's gaze never wavered. Maybe, but we don't need an escape. We're fighting for something bigger than you can comprehend." With that, the regulator's hum reached a deafening crescendo. The very walls of the vault shook as its power surged, and Lyra could feel the raw potential radiating from the device. A surge of energy rippled through the station, knocking the Vectra soldiers off balance. The leader's expression turned to one of panic as the regulator began to activate its secondary systems. Systems designed to amplify human strength, creativity, and intelligence. It was like a switch had been flipped, and for the first time in centuries, humanity was no longer exiled. The regulator was offering them a chance to reclaim their place in the galaxy. "We've awakened the regulator," Lyra said, her voice steady. "And now, humanity is coming for what is ours." The Vectra soldiers, stunned by the unexpected turn of events, hesitated for just a moment too long. That moment was all Lyra and Rook needed. The battle for humanity's future had begun in earnest. The energy from the regulator was overwhelming. It surged through the vault like a tidal wave, cascading across the station's systems and shaking the very foundation of Centurion Station. Lyra's senses tingled with the raw power flowing from the device, and she could feel it coursing through her veins, electrifying her thoughts, expanding her awareness. The regulator was more than a weapon. It was an amplifier, a conduit to humanity's lost potential. But there was no time to revel in the surge of power. The Vectra soldiers were recovering, their leader glaring at Lyra with fury. "You think you can control this?" The Vectra commander spat. "You've just awakened a force beyond your comprehension. You're playing with fire, and it will consume you." Lyra held her ground, her heart pounding. The regulator was alive now, but it was fragile. They couldn't afford to let it fall into enemy hands. And more importantly, they couldn't afford to let the Vectra stop their mission. "Rook," Lyra called over her shoulder, "can you get that security grid online? We need to clear a way to the escape routes." Rook didn't need to be told twice. His fingers flew over the secondary terminal, bypassing the locked files and reprogramming the station's security systems. "Give me just a few more seconds," he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. Lyra's attention returned to the Vectra soldiers. They were regrouping now, their blasters raised, ready for a fight. She couldn't let them get any closer to the regulator. Not now. In a fluid motion, she ducked behind a pillar and fired a few warning shots, the energy from the regulator flowing through her, making her aim more precise, her reactions faster. The Vectra scattered for cover, their blasters firing in retaliation, but Lyra was already moving, anticipating their every move. The regulator's power gave her a clarity she had never known before, a razor-sharp focus that made her feel unstoppable. "We're almost there," Rook shouted, his voice tinged with urgency. "I've bypassed the primary lockdown. The escape routes should be clear soon, but we've got to hold them off." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. Every second counted. The Vectra soldiers weren't the only threat, they were just the beginning. Word of the regulator's activation would spread fast, and soon, the entire galaxy would know that humanity was back. Their enemies would come for them, and the Exiles would need more than just a weapon. They would need unity, strength, and strategy to survive. The Vectra commander, now enraged by the unexpected turn of events, barked an order, and his soldiers advanced, trying to flank Lyra's position. Lyra's pulse quickened, but she stayed calm. With the regulator's power surging through her, she felt a deep connection to her ancestors, to the strength they had once possessed, to the ancient might of humanity's empire. As the first soldier rounded the corner, Lyra took a breath and fired a precise shot, striking the soldier's weapon and sending it skittering across the floor. Before he could react, she was already on him, disarming him with a fluid motion and pushing him to the ground. She moved with a speed and agility she never thought possible, her mind racing with strategies and countermeasures. The regulator was awakening something primal within her, something that tapped into the very core of human capability, the desire to survive, to fight, to win. With each move, the Vectra soldiers grew more disoriented. They had underestimated the Exiles. They had underestimated humanity's resolve. Rook's voice cut through the chaos. The escape routes are open. We need to go, now. Lyra took a moment to look at the regulator, which still hummed with energy, its crystal surface glowing brighter than ever. They had awoken something far beyond their expectations, and the path ahead was uncertain, but it didn't matter. The first steps had been taken. Humanity was no longer a footnote in the galaxy's history. They were a force to be reckoned with. Without a second thought, Lyra sprinted toward Rook, the sound of Vectra soldiers in pursuit growing louder behind her. She could feel the regulator's power amplifying her every step, her every thought. The escape route was just ahead, but they would need to move fast. The battle was far from over. As they reached the exit, the sound of Vectra weapons firing behind them, Lyra glanced over her shoulder. The regulator's energy continued to surge, growing stronger with each passing moment, and she realized with a chill that this was only the beginning. They had awakened humanity's true power. But in doing so, they had set into motion a storm that would sweep across the stars, changing everything. Lyra's pulse thundered in her ears as she sprinted down the narrow corridors, Rook close behind her. The Vectra soldiers were relentless, their footsteps heavy on the metal floors, closing in faster than she liked. But Lyra could feel it. The power of the regulator was surging through her, sharpening her instincts, granting her an uncanny awareness of the world around her. Every twist and turn in the maze of Centurion Station's corridors felt like a calculated move, and she could see the future unfold before her with startling clarity. "Keep moving," she shouted to Rook as the station's artificial gravity shifted beneath their feet. The energy from the regulator had disrupted the station's systems, causing unpredictable fluctuations that only added to the chaos. "We're almost there," Rook grunted, looking over his shoulder. "But we can't keep this up for long. The whole station's going to lock down soon." Lyra's mind raced. They had to make it to the hidden transport docks, but every second was precious. The escape routes would only stay open for so long before the Vectra triggered the station's final defenses, and they would be trapped. Worse, the regulator's power was growing, and the instability it caused in the station's systems could make everything unravel faster than they anticipated. As they turned another corner, Lyra saw a group of Vectra soldiers ahead, blocking their path. The hallway narrowed, leaving them no option but to engage. The soldiers raised their weapons, and Lyra's mind surged with strategies, the regulator's power amplifying her every thought. The first shot rang out, but Lyra was already moving, her body reacting before her mind could even register the threat. She ducked, narrowly avoiding the blaster fire, and fired a shot of her own. The first Vectra soldier dropped to the ground, his weapon disabled. Her heart pounded, but there was no time for hesitation. She rolled to the side, taking cover behind a maintenance panel as Rook returned fire, his aim precise as he picked off 2 more soldiers. "Move up," Lyra ordered, her voice calm, but her mind whirling. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The Vectra would only call for reinforcements, and soon the entire station would be swarming with their forces. They pushed forward, clearing their way through the soldiers with brutal efficiency. But with each step, Lyra could feel the strain. The regulator's energy was overwhelming her senses, her body on the verge of being consumed by its power. It was like an electrical storm inside her, crackling through her thoughts and muscles, urging her to do more, to push harder. They rounded another corner and came face to face with a heavily armored Vectra commander. The commander sneered at them, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You really think you can win this?" the commander mocked. "You're nothing but relics of a dead civilization. The regulator won't save you." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her body thrumming with energy. "We're not relics," she said, her voice cold. "We're humanity." With a swift motion, she dove into the fray. The regulator's power had unlocked something in her, something ancient, primal. She moved with a fluidity she had never known, her limbs working in perfect harmony, every strike landing with surgical precision. The Vectra commander's blaster fired, but Lyra was already on him, disarming him in a blur of motion before knocking him to the floor. Rook was at her side in an instant, covering her back. "We're wasting time," he said urgently. "Let's go." Lyra nodded, but as they continued to push forward, the intensity of the regulator's power became harder to control. She could feel it expanding inside her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of strength and clarity. The question no longer was whether they could survive. It was what they would do once they had the power to reshape the galaxy. And that realization hit her like a wave. The Vectra weren't their only enemies. There were countless factions across the galaxy that would see humanity's return as a threat. And the regulator wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to unlocking an entirely new era. As they reached the transport docks, Lyra stopped in her tracks, her mind ablaze with new thoughts, new possibilities. The exit was open, but beyond that lay an entire universe, one full of challenges and wars, but also opportunities for those brave enough to take them. Humanity had been exiled, but now they had the chance to reclaim their place at the center of galactic power. They could reshape everything. "You good?" Rook asked, his voice snapping her out of her reverie. Lyra met his gaze, the weight of what was happening settling in. "We're not just running anymore. We're going to take back what's ours." And in that moment, as the transport ships loomed ahead, Lyra understood. The war for humanity's future was only beginning. The transport ship loomed ahead, its engines already beginning to hum as the escape route began to seal behind them. Lyra felt the familiar surge of energy from the regulator, still thrumming inside her, reverberating through her very being. It was as though her connection to humanity's past had been reawakened, and she could sense the gravity of the moment, the tipping point of a new era. But there was no time for contemplation. The transport bay's doors were closing, and Lyra and Rook still had a few more meters to cover. Behind them, the sound of the Vectra soldiers regrouping was growing louder, their boots thundering on the metal floor. They wouldn't stop until they had them. "We're not going to make it," Rook called, his voice tense, as he pushed Lyra toward the ship. "Move now." Lyra's breath came in shallow bursts as she sprinted, every muscle in her body pushed to its limit by the regulator's power. She could feel the strength flooding her veins, but there was a dark undercurrent to it. The more she tapped into it, the more she felt like she was on the edge of something dangerous, something beyond her control. "We're not just running anymore," Lyra muttered, more to herself than to Rook. "What do you mean?" Rook asked, glancing back at her as they reached the ship's doors, which were beginning to close. "This isn't just about escaping anymore," she said, her voice firm. "It's about taking back what was stolen from us." Rook gave her a questioning look, but the words died in his throat when the transport bay doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud. The ship's engines roared to life, and Lyra felt the powerful thrust as they lifted off the station. The gravity of Centurion Station fell away, leaving only the stars and the silent void of space. They had made it. They were alive, but they weren't safe. "Is it done?" Lyra asked, turning to Rook, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb away. Rook nodded, wiping his brow. For now, the station's still in chaos, and we're free of the Vectra for the moment. But they won't stop. They'll hunt us down, especially if they figure out what we've unleashed. Lyra turned her gaze to the viewport, watching as Centurion Station became a distant dot against the backdrop of the dark expanse of space. There was no turning back now. They had not only escaped, they had triggered a chain of events that could change the entire galaxy. "The regulator was never just a weapon," Lyra said softly, her fingers gently touching the base of her neck, where the device's energy was still pulsing within her. "It's something more, something that could reshape everything." Rook stared at her for a long moment before replying, his voice low. "You're right, But that kind of power, it won't go unnoticed. Everyone who remembers humanity's fall is going to come after us. The Vectra, the Dominion, the Syndicate, the whole galaxy. I know, Lyra said, her eyes hardening with resolve. But we have something they don't. We have our past. We have the strength of the people who built the stars, and we'll use it to fight for our future. The stars outside the ship seemed to burn brighter now, each one a reminder of the long road ahead. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming humanity's place among the stars. Rook paced to the ship's cockpit, where the pilot was already plotting their course. And where do we go now? Lyra joined him at the controls, looking out at the vastness of space. The regulator was still humming, its power growing with each passing moment, but it wasn't the only force they needed to contend with now. The galaxy was full of dangers, and they had no illusions about how difficult the path ahead would be. We find our people, Lyra said, her voice steady but filled with purpose. We rebuild. We take back what's ours, and we make sure the galaxy knows that humanity is no longer a relic. We are the future. As the ship sped off into the unknown, Lyra could feel the weight of the journey ahead. The galaxy would be watching, and the Exiles would need to fight not only for survival, but for their place in a universe that had long forgotten their power. Humanity was returning, and this time, nothing would stand in their way.